React Router has support for React Server components, at least in preview mode, in experimental status. So if you download React Router by running npm install React Router, you will technically get a version that does not support it yet, at least right now when I'm recording this. You instead need to download an experimental version of that package, and we'll see that in just a second. But it's coming, it's getting there, and that of course means that soon, besides next.js as the big React full stack framework probably everybody from the React world knows, React Router will be an exciting alternative to next.js. Now, in case you missed it, you can already use React Router as a full stack framework, so as an alternative to next.js, even though it did not have React Server Component support yet, because since React Router version 7, the Remix framework, which was by the same team, was merged into React Router, and therefore you can essentially choose between the framework mode and the data or declarative mode, which together are the library mode, you could say, of using React Router. And if you use the framework mode, you can build full stack apps with it, where you can use the loader action pattern you might know from Remix to fetch and submit data. If you use the library mode, then you can use it as you always used React Router on the client side in single page applications and so on. But now React Server Component support is coming to that framework mode here. So when you're building full stack applications, so that you get a different way of loading your data, rendering your components, which you can use as an alternative to how you did it in the past with React Router. Now, as a side note, I have a book about React Key Concepts. The second edition is brand new. In there, I cover React Router, and I also cover React Server Components in depth, independent from React Router. So there you can dive deeper if you want to, not just into server components, but into React in general. And therefore, it might be a great, interesting resource, and you find a link to it below the video if you want to learn more about that. Now back to React Router. What's this RSC preview, this React Server Component preview all about? Well, the too long didn't read part here tells us that it has preview support, as I mentioned, and we'll take a look at this demo example in just a second, also at this a bit more complex demo. And what's important is that we got two main ways of using React Server Components in React Router applications in that experimental status. We can either return React Server Component content, so server rendered JSX code, you could say, from loaders or actions in existing routes without changing the route components themselves. We'll see that in a second. Or we can go all in, you could say, and build components that are React Server Components from the ground up, as you might know them from next.js. And just as you might also know it from next.js, with the support for React Server Components, React Router will also support the use client directive to mark some components as client components that should re-render on the client and that can therefore use React hooks like use state. And they will also support use server to mark functions as server functions, so that you can have functions that you can call from inside a form, from a client-side component, for example, but that will then actually execute on the server. So that's something we also get. And we'll take a look at all of that, of course, step by step when we go through that post. By the way, since this is a brand new feature, I have barely worked with it, just played around with it, just explored the code. So of course, only time will tell how well that works, but we'll just take a look at this post for now. Now, we also got middleware, and that's actually not a brand new feature. Instead, middleware is an unstable feature, so also in experimental mode, that is part of the standard React Router releases, though, that has been released a while ago already. So you can already use that in framework mode in your applications if you want to. It was part of, which version is it? 7.3, which was released in March. So that's a feature that's already there, but that also works together with React Server Components. And middleware, of course, is that thing you could, for example, use for authentication and so on. Also, very important is that this React Server Component support is not yet available in Vite-based apps, which of course isn't great because Vite is super popular, but Vite has no built-in support for React Server Components yet, and unfortunately, React Server Components is a feature that's part of React that heavily relies on the underlying bundler that processes the React code and that bundles the React application, because that bundler needs to split the code into code that runs on the server and code that runs on the client. So it's not React alone that does the work here. It relies on the bundler helping it, and Vite has no support for React Server Components yet, but that's also coming. For now, this demo uses Parcel for that reason, which is an alternative build tool and bundler in the end. So what does it look like? As I mentioned, there are two main ways of using it. One is that you return your React Server Components, your server rendered JSX code, from inside loaders. And in case you don't know, React Router has that thing called loaders and actions, which are functions that are tied to certain components, to routes in the end when using it in the framework mode. And React Router, before this entire React Server Component thing, would execute these loader functions right before a component, a route component, for example, is rendered, and actions when a form is submitted, essentially, and sends a request. And that is how you would fetch data and handle data submission before React Server Components. And that is a great pattern, actually. I like it a lot. The thing just is, if you use loaders for data fetching, then with React Router, your component that relies on that data would also render on the server with that data if you're using it in framework mode and so on. But if it would need to re-render, it would do so on the client, and then the loader would still be executed on the server, but the data would be sent across the wire to the client component, and then the component would there update the DOM and re-render and so on. With React Server Components, the idea is that the HTML code is actually produced on the server, and it's not just the data that's sent from the server to the client, but instead the finished HTML code in the end that's streamed to the client. It's a bit more complex than that, but that's how you can think of it. And that's why now one way of using React Server Components with that built-in support is to return JSX code in your loader function, here in this case inside of a content property, or as a value for the content property in this overall object that's being returned. And then in the connected component, you could access that JSX data and output it inside of that component. But now this JSX code would in the end always execute on the server. The HTML code that's based on that code in the end would therefore be produced on the server, kind of. And it's that finished HTML code or JSX code that will be streamed to the client. So it's not the data, or not just the data that's sent to the client, but instead really the finished markup. And that, of course, can be pretty beneficial for certain use cases. Now, the advantage of this approach is that it's super easy to use that and integrate it into existing React Router-based apps. Because if you have an app that uses React Router in framework mode here, you probably already have loaders that load data. And now you could just also return some JSX code and use that in the connected component and be done with it. And you would be using the React Server Component approach, or a React Server Component with that in the end. So that would be quite nice. It's not, however, the main way or the intended way, kind of building React Server Components in the long term, I guess. Instead, long term, midterm, whatever, the idea is that you build dedicated server component routes, as they call it. And that can be a bit confusing, as they also recognize, because now we have server component routes, but also React server components. And the idea is that server component routes are simply route components that are loaded once a certain route becomes active, that are React server components. So server component routes are React server components in the end. And the difference is that this component here, for example, would be a client component route, because it is a component that's loaded when a route becomes active that's also rendered on the client. Product layout, this component here would be rendered on the client. Server component routes, on the other hand, are component routes that are entirely and only rendered on the server. Now, how do you tell React Router that something should be a server component route and not a client component route, which is the default? Well, you name your component function server component. That is the pattern or the trigger here. Because normally when using React Router as a framework and when setting up routes, you would have a component route, let me find one, that would be exported as the default. So here in this example, that is a React component that would become active or that would be rendered when a certain route becomes active, and it is exported as a default. That's the standard pattern when using React Router in framework mode for telling React Router that a certain component is the main component that should be rendered when a route becomes active. Now, here, if you want to tell React Router with that React server component support that a certain route should be rendered only on the server as a React server component, you do that by not exporting it as a default. As you see, there is no default keyword here, but instead by naming it server component. And that's the important change. On the other hand here, this component has default, and therefore that would be such a client component route. So that's how you differentiate between the two. Now, if you don't have the default keyword, if you instead named your route component function server component, the entire component function will only ever be executed on the server. That's the important difference. And that allows you to run code in that server component that should only run on the server. For example, you could be reaching out to a database here. You could have your database credentials in there. There still might be reasons why you don't want to have that, but you at least would not be exposing them on the client side, because this code, the entire component code, would never make it to the client side. Instead, it would always be the finished JSX code, the finished markup that's streamed to the client side and that's rendered there. That's the idea here. Now, just as in next.js, where all routes are server components by default, here it's different, as I just mentioned, but just as in next.js, you can then use other components in your React server components, so in those server component routes here. And those components, as I understand it, would be treated as React server components by default, so they would only render on the server. But if you add use client to them as a directive, as you also might know it from next.js, then a component would be rendered on the client side. And here is a component, which is from one of the example apps that's linked in that article. And that button component has that use client directive, which means that this component function may be pre-rendered on the server, but will be updated and re-rendered on the client side. And therefore it can use React hooks like use form status here or like use state, which can only run on the client side in the end. So this button component here is used in that form component, for example. And that form component, on the other hand, would be a React server component. But just as in next.js, you can include client components in server components, just not the other way around, which is also something I cover in greater detail in my book, which I mentioned before. By the way, since I just was in this demo app here, that's the more complex one, which is linked in that blog article. There also is a simpler one. In both demo apps, you can see in the package.json file that we're dealing with an experimental version of React Router, so not the latest version, and that we're using parcel and not Vite, as I mentioned before. So that's the more, I guess, intended way or the standard way of building React server components, as you might also know it from next.js. Now, since we're still in a React Router app, we can still use action and loader functions, even when using this approach. Of course, we can use loaders and actions when using that other approach I showed you earlier, right? But even when building server components from the ground up, or however you want to call it, you can also still combine those with loaders and action functions. And in that case, the loader, for example, would run before the React server component runs. And that, for example, allows you to outsource some logic, like in this example here, authentication logic, from inside the React server component into that loader, and for example, redirect if a user is not authenticated. And in that case, if you do redirect here, this server component would never run at all. This code would not become relevant at all. You could also still return data in that loader, and that would still be available in that server component, but all that data fetching and rendering would only ever happen on the server. And you could alternatively also fetch the data in that React server component. So now with React server components, you have like two main places for doing that. You can do it in the server component, as you saw in this example, and as it's the standard in Next.js apps. But since it's React Router and it has this extra concept of a loader function, you could also fetch your data in the loader function to have a cleaner separation and keep your component focused on maintaining the UI or on rendering the UI and outsource the data fetching. That comes down to your preferences, I guess. Now, React Router also will introduce server functions, server actions as they're also called, which simply means that you can add a new file, put use server into it, and then all the functions that you export in there will be so-called server functions, server actions. Now, this is not a component function here. It's not a React server component. There is no JSX code being returned in there. Instead, that's a standard function, but because it's in a file with use server in it, and I guess you can probably also add use server inside of the function, as you might know it from Next.js, though I haven't verified it. And I can't because these demo apps, at least for me here, won't run. They always crash, so I can't verify that. But either way, you can define functions as server functions, and that means that these functions will also only ever execute on the server. That's the idea here. And that then, for example, allows you to call these functions from inside your component code, which of course will ultimately run on the client. This form will ultimately be submitted from inside the browser of your website visitor. But from inside there, you can call a function that's defined on the server and that will only execute on the server. And the way that works, also in Next.js, and as I also cover in this book, is that behind the scenes, an HTTP request will be sent on your behalf from the client side to the server side to trigger this function. So you can think of it as a REST API endpoint that's being created and maintained for you, that's exposed for you by that server-side code, and that's triggered when that form is submitted. So that you can, in your code, just call a function or just point at a function here, and all the heavy lifting is done for you by the framework, by React Router in this case, and by the bundler. In the end, you can use this approach. We'll see if it becomes the standard. Of course, since it's a React Router app, you could also use an action function. Because if you again go back to the current state of React Router, the state without React server components, then there is this concept of actions, action functions, that in the end can be triggered. And they're also called server actions here, but they're not the server actions you might know from Next.js, that can be triggered or that can be set up by defining a function named action, which has no use server directive in it or anything like that. Instead, it's just a function called action. And then if you have a form in your router component or some nested component using that form component that is provided by React Router, or some other submission mechanism like the use submit or use fetcher hooks. When you have something like this, React Router right now already, and in older versions as well, will call that action function for you, and that would also execute on the server and only there. So you can already do that. So the server functions approach here is an alternative to the server actions approach with that action function that's already supported by React Router. Because in that blog post, they're saying that server routes can still define loaders and actions. So you can still probably trigger those good old action functions from inside your React server component if you want to. But you can also build server functions like this, as you might know it from Next.js. You can also have client components, as I mentioned, with use client. If you have components that must also be able to re-render on the client side and where you need to use hooks like use state, which don't work in React server components. Now, there is something interesting here, because when dealing with Next.js, you might know that caching can be a bit annoying there. Caching and how data gets revalidated. And especially in older Next.js versions, you could run into problems where the behavior during development was not similar to what you saw in production, and that could cause a lot of confusion and problems. Now, React Router also, of course, aims to help you with batching and caching, but they try to do that without getting in your way and without causing unnecessary confusion. Now, what's the problem though? The problem is, of course, that one main idea behind React Server Components is that every component can fetch the data it needs from inside the component function, right? Like this code here could be fetching data from a database. And you cannot just do that in the main component that's being rendered for a route, but also in every nested React Server component. And the idea is that you can have a granular application where every component is basically responsible for itself and fetches the data it needs. And that's a great idea in theory. The problem just is that, as they describe here, for example, you could have multiple such actor link components on a given page. And if every single component fetches data about an actor, some might also fetch the same data for the same actor, but they would all be sending separate requests to some extra API or to the database or to any other data source. So you might have a lot of duplication there, a lot of duplicate requests. And here, React Router aims to help you by suggesting a library you can integrate into your app that helps with batching such requests. So that helps with detecting requests that are similar for a single render cycle, and that will then make sure that duplicate requests are avoided. Now, how does this work? Well, with help of middleware, here in the end, we can see an example. It's this library that was written by one of the React Router team members that is being used here to essentially, in a middleware, which runs in front of all routes, so for every component, every request in that middleware, we use that library to define that certain requests, a certain group of requests, should be batched together. We can also see that in one of the demo apps they provided. And there we can actually see that what we pass to batch is in the end a function that has the actual code that will be executed, in this case, the actual database code. And by wrapping that function with batch, with that extra library, that library will check which function calls of that function are similar. And it will then only call that once and reuse the result of that one call for all the calls that would have happened theoretically. So that is something you have to set up manually, a middleware like this, with that helper library, for example. But the only thing you really have to do is pass the function that may potentially be called multiple times to batch, and that will then do the rest. And this will ensure that for a single render cycle where some React server component with a bunch of child components may be re-rendered, if those child components make the same function calls, it only happens once and then the result is reused. And then once that render cycle is done, once that request is done in the end, this will all be discarded. The result of that function call will be discarded. And for the next render cycle, the next request that's sent from the client, it will start again so that you don't run into any weird caching issues. That's the current approach, at least. So a little bit of extra manual work required, but in the end, not too tricky and ensuring that you don't have any duplicate requests going on. Well, and that is in the end how you can use React Server Components with React Router, at least soon, hopefully. Again, it's not fully stable yet. That's what's coming. Since it's unstable, of course, details may change. This version was also put out there to get some feedback. It's also, of course, pending or depending on the Vite support to really be usable in more projects. But it's coming, it's getting there. And of course, it's great to not just have next.js as basically the only big option out there for using React Server Components, but to soon, hopefully, also have React Router. As I mentioned in this video already, you don't have to use that. You don't even have to use React Router as a framework. You can use it as a client-side routing library in your single-page application, as you always did. You can also use React Router in framework mode and use their loader action approach, as you also always could, with Remix since a couple of years. But soon, you can also use that React Server Component approach, which of course is also documented in the React documentation, and which is in the end the standard React way, or the thing that should become the standard React way for rendering components on the server, for fetching data on the server, and for handling data submission on the server. Now, I'll link the blog post, of course, below that video, link to my book and everything else. And yeah, please let me know in the comments what you think of it. Personally, I find that quite interesting. We'll see if it stays that way and how adoption will be, but please share your thoughts and let me know your opinion on this.